We do want to begin, though, with that breaking news in the push to vaccinate young children.
Yeah, Pfizer says its coronavirus vaccine is safe and effective in producing antibodies in kids between 5 and 11 years old. They've just released the results of their trial on younger kids this morning. They now plan to use that data to try to get emergency use authorization from the FDA. This comes at a time when more children are testing positive for COVID as they've been back in the classroom. Since the start of the pandemic, 5.3 million children have tested positive, and the CDC says more than 500 children have died from COVID in the U.S. NBC News medical contributor Dr. Natalie Azar joins us now to help break down Pfizer's trial results. Dr. Azar, good morning. So Pfizer says the vaccine provides an effective level of antibodies here for those children 5 to 11, but they didn't provide any data on how effective the vaccine is in stopping infection. We don't have that percentage like we have in the past. Why is that, and what other information could they be waiting for?
Right. Good morning, Savannah. So experts have basically said this looks like we have limited data, but it is encouraging. As you pointed out, what the Pfizer readout today really was about safety, tolerability, and immunogenicity. As you stated, that basically says that they found that this age group 5 to 11, with the dose that they were given, which was a third of the dose that older children and adults received, were able to mount a similar comparable immune response, that is level of antibodies, as the adult group. And so extrapolating from that, of course, they are projecting that that is going to offer the same benefit and effectiveness. Now, we're just getting sort of readout from all of this. And essentially what we're hearing is that, they've only had about 2,200 kids enrolled in the 5 to 11 age group. So there weren't enough cases of COVID to actually make a determination to give you that percentage of efficacy that we always like to talk about, greater than 90 or something like that. But at least what we know now is that the limited data that we do have does show that the vaccine was safe, well tolerated, and apparently as effective as the adult dose.
And so, Dr. Azar, I know a major difference with the Pfizer vaccine for kids is that these children were given a lower dosage. So is that normal with vaccines? Is that essentially what a vaccine for a child is, typically a lower dosage of that an adult would get? And then since we don't have that percentage yet, could that impact overall protection? Could this number be lower than it is for adults?
Right. Yes. So yes, when the pediatric trials are performed, they're essentially doing this dose de-escalation and age de-escalation. So they have 3 groups right now: ages 5 to 11, 2 to 5, and 6 months to 2 years. The age group 5 to 11 received 10 microgram as opposed to 30 in the adults, and the younger kids under the age of 5 are getting 3 micrograms. And remember, for children and for adults, really, there's really no benefit to overshooting in terms of the dose. For children especially, you want to really give the minimal amount of vaccine that's going to elicit the optimal immune response. And they think that they sort of have it at this level. Look, right now, this is going to go to the FDA, as it always does. And their advisory committee, the VRBPAC committee, is going to review all of the data and really dissect to see whether or not there are any safety signals. But I just need to point out again, with such a small number of kids, it's going to be hard to detect those rarer side effects like myocarditis and things like that. So we won't really know, of course, until and if it's approved, how well tolerated it is in the broader population. But again, the timeline is looking the same as it has for others: a few weeks for FDA approval. If it gets approved, it goes to CDC and they will make their recommendations. And I'm sure the American Academy of Pediatrics will weigh in on this decision as well.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that and kind of what needs to happen next. So in Pfizer's release on those trial results, the chairman and CEO released a statement saying these trial results provide a strong foundation for seeking authorization of our vaccine for children 5 to 11 years old, and we plan to submit them to the FDA and other regulators with urgency. So I want to ask you there about that last word, urgency. If they do plan to submit this quickly, what does that timeline look like? You mentioned a few weeks. So when could this impact kids actually who are going to school right now? When can they actually start getting that shot potentially? And you mentioned that we don't know about those broader side effects. Are you concerned at all about that?
Right. And so to the second part first, I think there's always this balance, right, between safety and yet the urgency of the pandemic. And I think, as one person pointed out, we've all pointed out actually, that this pandemic today is very different than it was a year and a half ago. And we've sort of, I think, gotten very comfortable with this idea that children are not so adversely affected. And of course, in relative numbers, especially the age group 5 to 11 appears to be least likely to be adversely impacted by this virus. That doesn't mean they aren't. And there's a lot of kids in that age group who are being admitted to the hospital. And even if they're not dying, that you can imagine is very physically and psychologically traumatizing to a young child. So that's what they're sort of faced with. That's the challenge, to balance that need of urgency versus safety. In terms of the timeline, I would give it a few weeks in the FDA's hands before the VRBPAC meets, and there'll be a public hearing again, and we'll hear their arguments for or against. That'll go to FDA. And then in short order, that's a pretty quick turnaround that the FDA will make their decision based on that advisory committee. So really, and then the CDC, of course, follows a couple of days later as we're waiting for the Pfizer booster CDC meeting this week. I think it's very possible, as former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb said, by Halloween. I think it's very, very plausible, if not unexpected, that kids might be getting vaccinated by Halloween this year. Yes.
All right, Dr. Azar, thank you so much. Lots to watch for in terms of Pfizer this week, so I'm sure we'll be talking to you again soon. Thank you. Now to the mass deportation of thousands of migrants along the southern U.S. border. The situation in Texas growing so intense that officials had to shut down part of the border. Thousands of those migrants, mostly Haitian, are now on flights back to their home country. Border Patrol officials said they have removed some 3,400 people in the past few days, and they expect that number to continue to increase. Migrants started coming up from the Mexico-Texas border last week, setting up camp under and near this bridge in Del Rio, Texas. NBC News Justice correspondent Julia Ainsley is following the latest on the border situation for us this morning. As she always is, her reporting is often what she's breaking these stories here for us and driving this whole conversation. Julia, thank you for joining us this morning. So tell us what is happening at this bridge in Del Rio, Texas this morning. Explain those pictures to us we just saw.
Yeah, well, thanks, Savannah. It is a very intense situation. That's a good word to describe it. Just last week, they saw the numbers under that bridge go from 5,000, which is still nothing they've ever seen before, to 10,000 to about 15,000 this weekend before they started those deportation flights. We know that yesterday there were 3 flights that left San Antonio directly back to Port-au-Prince, taking a lot of those Haitians that were congregated under the bridge back to Haiti. And now we expect those deportation flights to ramp up. We're able to see that 3 started yesterday. Now we could be looking between 6 to 8 per day this week and possibly even more next week. There are also a number of migrants who are being taken out and processed. For example, if they are able to claim asylum right now, some are able to claim asylum, some are being deported. The breakdown really seems to be that more single adults are subject to deportation. If a child comes unaccompanied due to the Biden administration policy now, they'll be able to stay. Families, a lot of times it's hit or miss, depending on whether or not they have an asylum claim. But really what we're seeing here is not necessarily Haitians who just left Haiti last month going back home. We're seeing a lot of people who left years ago, fleeing other crises in that country, now being returned to a devastated nation from political and natural disasters that they don't even recognize, Savannah.
And Julia, quickly tell us how these migrants got there. I mean, there are thousands of them. What are you learning about their journey to the U.S.-Mexico border?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, a lot of people did come up from Central America and South America. In fact, the mayor of Del Rio had something to say about that. Let's take a listen.
The individuals that you see here, and we asked directly today, they have been in other countries for 2 years. They are not directly victims of what's happened. And so that's also part of the equation as to why they can return to country, because they're not eligible for the asylum seeking opportunities that they're currently seeking. They're not victim to the recent event.
So you can see, I mean, it depends on the way you slice this. The mayor there is saying these people aren't eligible for asylum because they left Haiti a long time ago. But others are saying that they should be eligible for asylum because it's such a devastated nation to return to.
All right, Julia, thank you so much for your reporting here. The fallout continues after that shocking admission from the Pentagon that a botched drone strike in Afghanistan killed 10 innocent civilians, including 7 children. Top military brass are calling the August 29th strike in Kabul a tragic mistake. The Pentagon originally said the strike killed terrorists. NBC News global security reporter Dan DeLuce joins us now with more on this. Dan, good morning. So this drone strike, it happened in a dense city. There were plenty of civilians around who could and did talk to reporters about it. And it also happened, of course, when the world was watching every development that was happening with the evacuation from Kabul. How did the location and timing of the strike, the attention on the location of the strike, lead to this stunning admission from the Pentagon?
Yes, you're right. I think there were a few unusual circumstances because you had monitoring cameras by the charity that employed Zamari Ahmadi, the driver of the car. And so not only could reporters interview the family and other people in the neighborhood who could tell them about what he did for a living, the cameras also raised serious questions, and really none of it added up in terms of what the Pentagon was saying. So it makes you wonder about other drone strikes where there isn't that kind of access and isn't that kind of television monitoring. But the Pentagon obviously forced to acknowledge Friday that it was a tragic mistake.
And Dan, you just touched on something like this, but one member of the victim's extended family says the casualties were actually employees of American organizations who were planning to travel to the U.S. on several different immigration programs. Tell us more about those who died.
There were 10 victims, and the driver of the car, who was falsely believed to be somehow linked to ISIS and was not, was a man who worked for Nutrition International in Pasadena, California. It's an organization that tries to address malnutrition in Afghanistan. And then there was another victim who was a contractor for the U.S. military in the past and had been in the Afghan army. And then 7 children, several toddlers. So this is just really awful and really hard to comprehend. All innocent civilians, absolutely no connection to any kind of terrorist group.
It really is just heartbreaking. And Dan, relatives of this drone strike and the victims are calling for compensation as well as punishment. Will someone be held accountable here?
That is really the key question. You know, in the past, disciplinary measures in these kinds of incidents tend not to be very harsh, and there are rarely court-martial proceedings. Now, General McKenzie did say there would be reparations, there would be compensation for the survivors, for the relatives, and that there will be possible disciplinary action. But we'll have to see. Human rights groups said just the fact that they apologized and acknowledged what happened was an important first step, but there needed to be total transparency and a really thorough investigation and people held accountable. And keep in mind that under the laws of war, even if you don't intentionally kill civilians, you can still commit a war crime because you've possibly not tried to sufficiently distinguish between civilians and combatants. And we don't know if that happened here, but that'll be a question for the U.S. military going forward.
All right, Dan DeLuce, thank you so much. Now, the White House is on its heels not just because of that drone strike in Afghanistan, but also a range of other issues, from the handling of COVID booster shots to climate change and tensions with France over last week's nuclear submarine deal. But the administration is looking to find stable footing at the UN this week. This evening, President Biden will meet with Secretary General of the United Nations as the General Assembly meets in New York. Let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli. He's following the president this morning from Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. Mike, good morning. So, I mean, these are just unprecedented crises, all overlapping one another. How's the president going to handle each of these? What is his goal through this week?
Well, Savannah, the president really has 3 big goals as he heads to the UN. The first is to try to build momentum for global action on climate. We got a little bit of a taste of this on Friday when he met with European leaders to announce a new methane emissions target. This week is all about building momentum towards that summit in Glasgow, Scotland, in which they want to really up the ante from the Paris Climate Accord from the Obama administration. He also wants to set a new global goal on vaccinations, particularly in the developing world. And then the third goal is much more thematic. It's in line with what we've been hearing a lot about, the president trying to make the case for democratic values, setting the rules of the road in the 21st century rather than autocracies like China and Russia. But Savannah, that's what the president wants to talk about. Unlike when he went to Europe this summer and got a warm reception from his allies and was really able to set the conversation on American terms, he has a lot to answer for, as you just laid out, and it's going to a real test of his diplomatic skills this week, Savannah.
Absolutely. Let's talk about one of those that I mentioned just a moment ago, and that's this increasing fallout with France after they were left out of the U.S., UK, and Australian nuclear submarine deal. How's that going to play into President Biden's appearance at the United Nations this week?
So, Savannah, usually the UN General Assembly is sort of the diplomatic version of speed dating. You have all these world leaders in one place at once, and you would see the president going from meeting to meeting to meeting with a number of them. And likely France would have been one of them, except President Macron does not intend to be there. This is still a COVID-focused event that requires some of the precautions that you typically see. And so the president may be able to avoid the in-person awkwardness of that, but we expect, based on what French officials are telling different wire services, that they will speak by phone this week, and that's going to be important. But the president may also have some other announcements in store that will address some of the other European tensions over COVID, and maybe that is a way to neutralize this issue. But remember, the French have their own presidential election coming up next year, and some of the reaction U.S. officials believe is driven by domestic politics and less about international politics.
And Mike, you mentioned one of the things that the president wants to talk about, wants to have a focus on, is this vaccination push globally. But I mean, here at home, he was dealt a blow on his booster shot plans for people under 65. How could appearing on a global stage at the UN in the middle of this pandemic, how's that affect his credibility with these issues that we've seen with this rollout here at home?
So ironically, Savannah, one of the setbacks here in terms of the FDA's announcement on Friday as a setback to that booster plan is in line with what the president wants to talk about here on a world stage. Remember, some of our international allies, especially those in the developing world, were critical of the U.S. for moving ahead with an aggressive booster shot rollout when there were so many countries that still don't have high vaccination rates with single doses, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia. And so the president was planning to convene a virtual summit that is still on the cards on Wednesday, and perhaps the setback on the home front may lead to a little bit of goodwill on the foreign front.
All right, Mike Memoli, lots to watch for this week as the president heads to the UN General Assembly. Thank you so much. Let's get a check now on your morning news now weather, which means that it's time for Bill Cairns to join us. Hey, Bill, happy Monday. Good morning.
Hey, happy Monday. Hope you had a wonderful last weekend of summer. Can you believe it? It's over. Yeah, we're headed now towards fall, and it feels like it this morning in New England and in the Northwest. It definitely cooled off significantly, but not the case in the middle of the country. Still a very warm day ahead. We have two storms that are going to be troublesome, one in the southeast and the one going through the northern plains. Today, 6 million people at risk. We're going to see some strong thunderstorms popping up almost over the top of you in Des Moines as we go throughout the late afternoon. They'll sweep towards the Quad Cities and through Wisconsin as we go throughout the early evening. Isolated tornado, but more wind damage is the concern. Those storms should weaken and die off by the time they get to Chicago, and that won't be till about 10 p.m. We had a lot of flash flooding over the weekend in areas of Alabama. We still have one flash flood warning near Chattanooga. We're going to get drenched today. Savannah up towards Charleston. We could see upwards of 2 to 3 inches of rain on the South Carolina coast. And believe it or not, some of this moisture is associated with Nicholas from almost like a week and a half ago. Indianapolis is also getting drenched this morning. A lot of rain from areas of Kentucky to Indiana. So your week ahead forecast, this is as good as it gets. D.C., Philly, New York, Boston through New England. Enjoy this morning and today. Absolutely lovely. But 101 in San Antonio, 100 in Dallas today. Give me a break. It will get cooler towards the middle of the week. The big, huge rainstorm is heading through the Ohio Valley and the Mid-Atlantic. That'll be in the Northeast on Thursday. Then by Friday, it begins to exit, feeling like fall through much of the country. So kind of a quiet week. No big tropical systems heading our way either. So, we're going to welcome in fall happily.
All right. We love to hear that, Bill, and hopefully that means it's a little bit easier of a week for you because you have been covering it all for us. Thanks, Bill. See you in a bit.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.